So now we've met Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit and learned that they're wanting to play tricks on each other. Let's see what happens next. This chapter is called The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed, "Ah!" "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed!" "I'll bet it's that giant skilly wiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet!" "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. See, there they are, each in their own bed. Mrs. Twit screaming because something's crawling over her feet. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillows. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. Ding! When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. So there's the frog jumping in the water. And then he jumped on Mrs. Twit's head. She screamed again. "Ah! By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Sweet dreams, Mr. Frog. Ding! Now, the Wormy Spaghetti. I wonder if someone's getting back. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. There's Mr. Twit eating what he thinks is spaghetti. Mrs. Twit looks quite happy. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which, of course, had no worms. "It's called a squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot. Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was no tomato sauce Soon there was tomato sauce all over his chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind, he said, talking with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr. Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavor. Buy the other kind next time. There he is with his empty plate. Ding. Miss Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy? Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty, bitter taste? Why? He said. Because it was worms, cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. There she is. Aren't they a lovely couple?